Hello, everyone. Welcome to our brand new podcast, 80s TV Ladies. This is a special pop culture podcast where we take you on a journey to the fabulous, exciting, female-driven television past. I'm Susan Lambert Hatem, an independent writer, director, and producer who believes in true love and medium adventure.
And I'm Sharon Johnson, Susan's co-pilot. I'm a television, podcast, and Christmas Carol enthusiast. On 80s TV Ladies, we'll be examining beloved female-driven TV shows of the 1980s.
With some sidebars to the 70s and 90s, and really, frankly, wherever we want to go, because it's our podcast.
So we can talk about whatever we want. But mostly, we'll be talking about that special time, 1980 through 1989, when television was big hair, big shoulder pads, and 3 big networks.
So welcome to our podcast Zero. We're looking at female-driven television shows because we're interested in how those shows got made, how they were influenced by the times we lived in, and in turn, how they might have influenced pop culture trends and television shows that followed.
I think we have to start by setting the stage for what 80s TV meant in the 80s decade. The 80s changed everything. They were known as the greed decade.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. I remember that speech from the movie Wall Street, 1987, directed by Oliver Stone, written by Stone and Stanley Weiser. It was sort of horrifying to me that Gordon Gekko, the man who's the character, played by Michael Douglas, who said that line and waxed poetic about how fabulous it was to destroy everything for money, how he became an icon of the 80s and what businesses should aspire to, and instead of becoming a pariah for being a psychopath. But for me, the most immediate symbol of change for the 80s was the 1980 election, where beloved turned beleaguered President Jimmy Carter lost his reelection to the folksy charm of actor turned politician Ronald Reagan. And then Reaganomics and conservative backlash to the advancements of civil and human and environmental rights of the 60s and 70s happened somehow.
It was a monstrous time.
Indeed. I couldn't agree more, because the rise of Reagan and corporate interests, the cutting of taxes and regulations saw the rise of cable television, remote control, the VCR, HBO, MTV, and CNN, which launched in 1980 as a 24-hour news broadcast station, led us down the road to where we are now when it comes to cable, quote, news, close quote.
Yeah, we're in an information age, an over-information age. But the CNN, the 24-hour news channel was again, it's so hard to take people back to that time unless you lived it and realize that television used to turn off. It used to stop broadcasting. And it'd be the end of the broadcasting day. And certainly news was only on at 6 and 11 and 10 a.m., And then it was suddenly 24 hours a day, every news, everywhere, and turning news more, in some ways, more turning news into entertainment, for sure. Because instead of it being, here's the top stories of the day, it was, we have to make every hour what's the top story of the hour and get viewers. Anyway, I lived in Atlanta, just outside of Atlanta in Georgia, and CNN was started in downtown Atlanta by Ted Turner in the Omni Complex. The Omni Complex had Ted Turner's 24-hour news channel, an ice skating rink, a 14-plex, unprecedented at the time, movie theater, in which one theater always showed the movie Gone with the Wind.
Really?
Every day.
Really?
Every day.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
Okay.
Balderdash. I don't believe you.
It happened. It was bizarre. Make of that what you will for the South and Georgia. Anyway, but I loved going down there. Also for like less than a year, the Omni International housed The World of Sid and Marty Krofft. This is not about the 80s. This is about 70s television. The World of Sid and Marty Krofft actually lasted less than a year. But part of apparently the appeal of it was like an amusement park based on the world of Sid and Marty Krofft. These television shows that were made in the 60s and 70s, Sigmund the Sea Monster, Land of the Lost, my personal favorite and 70s TV ladies, superheroes, Electra Woman and Dyna Girl. Did you watch Electra Woman and Dyna Girl, Sharon?
I did not. I was an Air Force brat and spent 4 years in my adolescence living in Japan with no access to American television. So I missed the whole Sid and Marty Krofft of it all, which is not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but just something that I missed. I often feel like there's kind of like a little bit of a hole in my television viewing history, because while there are things that I'm aware of, there are things that I didn't get to see as a result, either when they aired or eventually kind of missed them via syndication. Because during that time, if you didn't watch something live, you either caught it on the repeat during the summer or you completely missed it. There was no VCR. There was no DVR, certainly. And there were no DVDs. There were no VHS copies of the entire season of a television show that would allow you to go back and find or rewatch something that everybody else had either seen or missed. So it was a very different time in television viewing. It came and went, basically.
It came and went. If you didn't see it when it aired, you really had to wait and go track it down if you wanted to see it. You had to wait for it. You had to wait for it, either summer repeats or as you said, syndication, which would typically happen after the show was done.
Right.
So it's just, again, it's not something you can understand if you're in your 20s now and everything is available all the time, everywhere.
If you can find it. So
if you can find it. Yeah, it's too much now. Like at the same time, there were only 3 networks at the beginning of 1980. Plus, again, HBO, MTV started in 1981. And so it was the beginning of cable, the beginning of different channels and other options. And it was also, again, beginning of the 80s. You couldn't capture your shows. By the end of the 80s, we had the VCR, and suddenly you could time shift on and make sure you caught shows you wanted to keep watching, and you wanted to make sure you didn't miss. So again, a great, incredible decade of transition of sort of chaos and falderall, but also, so this is fun. We haven't even explained why we're so excited about falderall and balderdash. But you have to keep listening and we'll figure it out as we go.
Yes, we're going backwards.
We're going backwards. We're going backwards and forwards. And that's part of the show.
Yeah, it was a different time.
It was back in the time when you went to work in an office.
So
in
true.
the before time. And there were all these people in cubicles all next to each other and desks and fax machines. It was fabulous. There's a lot of love for 80s pop culture out there. There's a lot of 80s pop culture podcasts. Mm-hmm. There's none, as far as we know, devoted to female-driven television shows of the 1980s. I think we're very specific in what we're going to be covering. But I think it's also really interesting to realize that so many people that didn't live through the 80s, like if you don't live through any decade, but that decade in particular, because it started a lot of things that we just sort of take for granted now, which is sort of the blockbuster movie with, Raiders of the Lost Ark and E.T. and Return of the Jedi and Back to the Future.
And it also led to the chase in the entertainment industry for the next big thing, which was a totally different mindset in terms of what the various studios were trying to do, and led to a situation where the appetite from the big studios for more thoughtful, one and done kinds of properties started to wane. I don't think anybody saw it initially, but it definitely was something that's happened over the last few decades.
The reason we're here today is during the pandemic, like everybody else, we started streaming a lot of shows, and And we started streaming 70s shows, Mary Tyler Moore and Bob Newhart and Barney Miller. And that led us into the 80s, which was really more the era that I grew up in and where I started paying attention to television and who was making television. And my love of television movies would end up basically leading me to move to Los Angeles to go to USC Film School. So I got really fascinated by looking back at those 80s television shows, and in particular, the female-driven ones and how women were treated in 80s television, which was very uneven. We had a lot of groundbreaking women's shows coming off the 70s, and we have some groundbreaking shows in the 80s, but they're a little more complicated, I think. So that's one of the reasons we're literally doing the podcast, is because of, I have questions.
Well, it's always, I think it's always good to kind of look back a little bit and see how we got to where we are now. Either some lessons to be learned or some interesting stories to find, and that can give us some insight into the television world that we're in today. Because nothing happens in a vacuum. There's always something that happened before that led to this moment. So.
And certainly, again, as we see these monumental and often horrific events happening now, where you're like, how did we get here? You can travel back to the 80s and start drawing some lines to get us here. Mm-hmm. And so some of the shows we're going to look at, I'm big fans of. Some of the shows we're going to look at, you were big fans of. Some we were both big fans of. And Sharon and I have known each other for a long time. And we've always talked about movies and television for as long as we've known each other. We met in the 80s.
You were at film school, which takes up a lot of your time.
I did not watch a lot of television at film school, although I did have a VCR.
The VCR was such a game changer. It was really astonishing. It was really an astonishing game changer. And the idea that it was almost like magic that you could record television shows and then watch them and rewatch them as many times as you wanted to, if it was an episode that you particularly liked or a show that you particularly liked, was really like magic. And for me, it's you were talking about what your experience in growing up and watching television. I was a little different. Your mind went to the how and the who and the what, hence your decision eventually to go to film school. I just wanted good TV. I really wasn't thinking a lot about how this happened to appear on my television. It seemed like there were, I don't know, I guess I could almost compare it to the wizard behind the curtain. All I knew was that every fall, Good Old TV Guide would publish their massive edition, which listed all the TV shows that were new, all the TV shows returning, as well as these wonderful charts of what was on each night. And it was very easy to keep track of in terms of the content, because there were only 3 networks. And looking back, I realized that while there were a lot of shows that I watched, there certainly were a lot that I didn't, but I knew of them. You knew of every show. Because it wasn't, for a television junkie like me, it wasn't that hard to keep track of in that respect, because there were only 3 networks. It's impossible to do that now. It's impossible to hear of, let alone have a basic understanding of every single solitary thing that's available right now, because there's just so much, and it's so hard for anything to break through. But that said, I think I was always more attracted to, for the most part, shows that did have female leads or certainly strong female characters. Those were the shows that I found myself being interested in. I do know that looking back, even as a kid when I was watching TV, I wasn't interested in kid shows. I want to know what the grown-ups were doing and watch those shows. So in terms of what I chose to watch, it tended to be shows, I think, that I found interesting and fun and in some ways enlightening. But there was a very strong, contingent of female-driven shows that I watched. As long as there weren't a lot of kids around, I was probably pretty interested in it.
I'm super interested to explore the feminist aspect of these shows, mm-hmm. and who the feminist characters of the 80s were, 80s television. I'm a huge fan of the action detective shows like Remington, Steele, Moonlighting, Cagney, and Lacey. But we're also going to cover comedies. Mm-hmm. Like The Golden Girls, Murphy Brown, A Different World. And so like once you start the dive, like because we've started our dive and you're like, oh, wait, and then there's this show. Oh, wait, and then there's this show. So it's very exciting. And it's sort of, I'm excited for it to sort of organically unfold before us, hopefully, as we start down this interesting path, but I'm curious the shows that you're excited to look at and the shows that I'm excited to look at, but also what we're going to do, what else we think we'll do with the show.
These shows are 40 years old, approximately.
Yes.
Things were very different then. And I'm trying really hard in watching them not to put too much of a 2022 lens on a show from 1980 something. It helps that I was alive and aware during the time when these shows aired. So I had more context in terms of what else was going on around them. Because sure, anything I think you look back on, there'll be some moments that would not have, that perhaps don't stand the test of time. And that's okay, because the moments that we're watching are the ones that got us here today. And I'm trying to keep a lot of that in the front of my mind as I'm watching it. But I also just want to have fun. I want to enjoy, I
know. Well, I was also really enjoying watching these shows. I'm also excited to see if we can get on some special guests. And I think we're going to have on some special guests. We are going to have on some amazing actresses and creators. Some we can tell you about right now. Some we can't tell you about yet. Some we're still tracking down, but just a few. We're going to have on actress Martha Smith and writer-producer Eugenie Ross-Lemming, both amazing and both from Scarecrow and Mrs. King. We cannot wait to interview these folks and talk to them about what it was to make a show in the 80s, versus what it is to make now. And then what it is to have been a woman making television in the 80s, because it was a different world. It is a different world now. Some people are trying to push us back to before the 80s, but we have moved forward, and some people haven't. But I am very much a sucker for finding out people's stories. And so we're going to be tracking down some folks from these shows. Yeah,
in front of and behind the camera that can help maybe fill in some of the, I don't want to say holes, but fill in some of the context around getting these shows made and how they were made. And it's gonna be, I can't wait. It's going to be a great ride.
It's going to be a great ride. So I think we do know where we're starting. I watched a lot of action shows. I'm a sucker for Stephen Cannell. Stephen Cannell had an end credit at the end of all his shows where it basically was the moment I realized oh, somebody is writing this. And it was the best end credit ever, because it was literally him typing on a typewriter and getting to the end of the page and throwing the page out. And then the page became a graphic, and it was oh my God. He created that show. It was at the end of every Stephen Cannell show. And I'm a sucker for the buddy action comedy show. And that was his specialty. And so I think that was the first time I went, oh, wait, so television is something that gets written. But we're going to start with a show that actually was the first time I noticed female names, women names as creators of the show. We're going to start with a little action comedy show called Scarecrow and Mrs. King. It's sort of adorable to me. It's surprisingly dark, an action-y spy caper show. It starred Kate Jackson and Bruce Boxleitner. It was created by the writing and producing team Eugenie Ross-Lemming and Brad Buckner. It ran from 4 seasons from 1983 to 1987, and it showed how much fun it was to be a mom and a spy.
And as it turns out, this is one of the many shows that I was aware of, but was surprised to realize that I'd never really watched it. I don't exactly know why. Because now watching it now, it seems like it would have been right up my alley. Have no idea what was in my head at the time, but I think it's a great place to start because it combines a lot of things. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah,
it's a lot of fun, and I hope that everyone will watch along with us.
And I am excited about the fact that it wasn't a show you explored. You know, it never occurred to me that we wouldn't know all the same shows, or at least have watched all the same shows, except that, of course, we wouldn't. We were in different places. We're a little bit different in age. So I'm really excited that we'll both be discovering certain things about these shows as we go.
I'm definitely a sucker for a mystery. Throw a mystery out there, and I'm one of those people. I need to find out. It took me a long time when I started reading mysteries like Ellery Queen and the Earl Stanley Gardner, Perry Mason books to stop myself from going to the end to find out who did it. It was hard, but I managed to wean myself off of that because it's fun to try to figure out who did it. And I have to admit, when it came to the Ellery Queen books, I never figured it out, but it was still
Ellery
fun.
Queen was impossible. I also read Ellery Queen, and it felt impossible. Ellery Queen was the ones I read. There were like some sort of pulp novels I liked a bit. The one I remembered that was a female author was Charlotte Armstrong. These were like more like 60s, and they were more like pulp mysteries, you know, and adventures kind of things. She wrote this one called A Dram of Poison that I still sort of remember because it was so cleverly constructed. A dram of poison has been put in something, and they're trying to get it back before the person gets poisoned. But it becomes this like, oh my God, we have to go to this place, and then we have to go that way. Like they're chasing the poison that's been put in the wrong place. So I now looking back at it, I'm realizing, like that was more like an action comedy, like an absurdist piece than an actual mystery. There was a mystery to why things were unfolding the way they were unfolding. But anyway, I just remembered that. So we're going to find out all sorts of things.
Indeed. I didn't read, I have to admit, now that I think about it, I don't remember reading many, if any, really female mystery writers back when I was reading the Ellery Queens and the Earl Stanley Gardners of the time. Never read Agatha Christie, I have to admit that. But I was a huge fan of both Sarah Paretsky and Sue Grafton, who both had terrific series of books about two very different female private detectives. Love both of those series as well. Anyway,
yes.
we digress. Maybe that's a whole other podcast.
It's a whole other podcast. Is the mystery books. So we're going to start with Scarecrow, Mrs. King. We're going to do a few episodes looking at different aspects of the show, really start looking at the pilot and how the show got made. Then we'll probably look season to season, I'm thinking, because there's so many interesting things.
Yeah, this is not going to be an episode by episode podcast. It's more of an overview of the seasons and the things we learned, but it's definitely not intended to be for someone who's looking for a discussion of every single episode of every single show that we cover. There may be some specific ones maybe we spend more time on, but in general, I think a season to season kind of approach is great because it also allows us to get more guests in to talk about everything. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So one part we're going to have in maybe not every episode, but the episodes, because we are clearly big readers, is our audiography. And it's going to start with kind of where to watch these shows. So for Scarecrow, Mrs. King, basically it doesn't seem to be available for free streaming anywhere. So it is for sale or rent on almost all of them. YouTube video, Amazon Video, Apple TV. One of the things we have discovered, Sharon discovered this, is that check your local library. They often have DVDs you can rent. I mean, not rent, but borrow for free. And they had Scarecrow, Mrs. King,
yeah,
right?
Absolutely. And I mean, I know that not many people perhaps still have the ability to play a DVD, whether it be through a DVD player or through your computer. If you have an internal drive or an external drive, you can connect. But if you do, it's definitely something you can probably find at your local library.
And if you do have a DVD player and you're still a Netflix DVD subscriber, you can get seasons 1 and 2 of Scarecrow, Mrs. King from Netflix DVD subscription service. So the website we're going to shout out for our podcast zero is, of course, our own 80stvladies.com. And the book I'm going to shout out for our podcast zero is The Great Book of 1980s Trivia, Crazy Random Facts and 80s Trivia by Bill O'Neill. Because I think it's fun if you haven't experienced the 80s or you don't remember it because you experienced it too much. You can check that out. And also a television series of the 1980s, Essential Facts and Quirky Details by Vincent Terrace. Both of those are available on Amazon, and there'll be a link on our website to find them. Sharon, we're going to get serious for a second.
Sure.
Even on Podcast Zero, we really didn't expect to, but it's important. Here at 80s TV Ladies, we support women and all people's body autonomy. Every person has fundamental rights. We believe abortion is necessary health care, vital for pregnant people, because it's a human right. So in addition to our 80s TV Ladies audiography, we have some special shout outs in this episode. So if you want help or you want to help, here are some websites you can go to.
First is the website I Need an A, and that is INEEDANA.com. Next, the National Network of Abortion Funds. Their website is abortionfunds.org. Next, Indigenous Women Rising. IWRISING.org.
And next is Mississippi's only abortion clinic in the entire state, which also is fallen under this recent ruling. ThePinkHouseFund.com. That's ThePinkHousefund.com. And there's an organization that I work with called TRRFoundation.org. TRR-FOUNDATION.org. There you can find links to many more sites, including local and state resources.
Whether it's one of these organizations or one that you know of and that you have supported or want to support, please reach out to them. Do what you can. Give what you can.
We want to give a shout out to our audio engineer, Kevin Ducey, co-producer, Melissa Roth, plus our social media manager and associate producers, Megan McKiernan and Sergio Perez.
And what's the 80s ladies-driven TV show that you remember or have heard of and want us to cover? And what are your favorite 2020s TV ladies? Let us know on the website 80stvladies.com. That's 80stvladies.com, and on social media at 80s TV Ladies.
Thank you so much for listening to Podcast Zero. We hope you'll be joining us for our first official episode, The First Time, where we'll be talking about Scarecrow Mrs. King, Kate Jackson, Bruce Boxleitner, as well as female showrunners, actual women showrunners.
We hope 80s TV Ladies brings you joy and laughter and lots of fabulous new and old shows to watch, all of which will lead us forward toward being amazing ladies of the 21st century.